but culture is real. In the sense
No.
that, like, because people live culture, they don't live race, right? Like, if you look at, like, especially colorism, black people have completely different cultures depending on what country they're in Africa, and they're gonna be very different from African Americans. The kind of colorism is really, you know, much more arbitrary than culture is, right? Like, culture is something just people live and breathe, right? And, I like to compare him Michéa's views seem to me kind of similar to Sheldon Wolin. He was always very skeptical of, like, centralization, the Republican Party, but also very skeptical he was skeptical actually of cosmopolitanism. He had you could say even a localist tendency,
Yeah,
where he was skeptical of nationalism. Actually, he thought nationalism often was homogenizing culture itself.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, which is true. Also, I mean, there's a whole narrative about this in French history. You know, there's this famous argument called "peasants into Frenchmen" by Eugen Weber. In the early 1800s, there were plenty of French farmers who had only sort of the vaguest kind of idea that they were actually French, right? You know, that at a very kind of tangible level, the conception of nationhood and nationality had not really sort of trickled down into the most kind of remote sort of countryside. People knew they were sort of from around here, right? And I mean, I'm not trying to say that it was zero kind of conception, but you know, it's possible to imagine the nation actually not sort of being that something that was actually that materially present in your life. But anyway, it is that sort of notion that you were just referencing, that this real kind of way in which regional identities kind of lose their distinctives, even at sort of the most basic level of, you know, in France, a lot of them had their own sort of, you know, patois or dialect, you know, and those kind of get wiped out by sort of state building. So yes,
It does seem its tendency towards more localism, and to an extent, I don't quite share that position. I'm more sympathetic to civic nationalism from a Republican point of view, but I actually do respect, out of all the critiques of nationalism, the localist critique the most because it still believes in culture. What I'm very skeptical of is actually the kind of globalist position, which sometimes is espoused by Marxists who, in the name of internationalism, but I feel like sometimes the line is blurry between that and liberal globalism, where there's almost a kind of disregard for culture as some kind of tribal, primitive vestige that needs to be overcome. This idea of like Homo sapien unity almost. And there's something nice about it too, but you can't run societies that way. I mean, and it's also just most people don't identify with that. And there is something also just nice about having a home, about having a rootedness.
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I'm not saying I'm going to rule the world or I'm going to change the world, but I guarantee that I will spark the brain that will change the world, and that's our job. We might not be the ones, but let's not be selfish, and because we're not going to change the world, let's not talk about how we should change it.
By moderately conservative, I mean simply, before you act, think well about all possible consequences.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
You want to do politics, you got to fucking understand the issues. It's not all just emotions and fantasy life.
Remember, my friend, a wise man can learn more from a foolish question than a fool can learn from a wise answer.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I am here with Michael Behrent, a scholar who helped translate a book that recently came out, which I had the privilege, the luxury of getting early access to, or just, access to at all. A book called Towards a Conservative Left. Now, hold on before you rush to the comments. Conservative left? What? That sounds like an oxymoron. We'll get to why that title, was chosen and what that means. Before talking about, we know who this book is about, and it's it's basically the collected works of Jean-Claude Michéa, a very, very interesting political thinker in France, and Michael Behrent helped translate all his main works into English. It's a really good coincidence that I got exposed to this book through my comrade Daniel Tutt, who I had a conversation about Michéa's work recently on his channel, Emancipations Podcast, because prior to, getting exposed to this book, I was on my own. I had on my own discovered Michéa, and it was just because I was trying to look at thinkers who are similar to Christopher Lasch, and Christopher Lasch is a very big influence on my thinking. And Michéa is sometimes dubbed the French Christopher Lasch. One article dubbed him as that. I've looked at a lot of the essays, and I discussed one of them in particular with Daniel Tutt, The Unity of Liberalism. I just think provides a very unique perspective to left discourse. But without further ado, Michael, would you like to introduce yourself at anything I didn't include yet? And what made you want to put this book together?
Sure. So I'm a professor of history at Appalachian State University in North Carolina. My areas of expertise are modern European history, modern French history, but I've always had a strong focus on intellectual history, i.e. the history of ideas, with a special reference to the history of political thought. I've done a lot of work on Michel Foucault, and this interest in Michéa really is quite independent of that. I don't see it as sort of coming out of that other interest. Interestingly, so how did I get involved in or hear about Michéa? What happened was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I read an article in Le Monde, which is the French newspaper of record. And it was about Michéa and Michéa's influence. And what struck me about it was it emphasized the way that basically Michéa's work, had sort of spawned thousands of sort of small discussion groups, especially among young people. Now, I'm probably not saying that exactly right, but that was kind of the gist of the article. So I knew him as this essayist, this polemicist who regularly wrote books. But what was striking, was arguing that was this article claimed that Michéa kind of had this underground influence. And I think that the essence of Michéa's appeal was the way that his thought and the themes of his work combine, in many ways, a robust left critique of many aspects of capitalism, as well as more generally capitalist, and one might say sort of late liberal society, with a genuine suspicion and at times even maybe hostility towards the idea of progress. And I think some of these people may have had sort of, a kind of environmentalist orientation, but it wasn't that simple. There was even sort of reference that some sort of religious and maybe Catholic groups had, were part of this discussion. So I decided I wanted to dig deeper into this, and I just started reading Michéa. I wrote an article about him for Dissent, and I was able to ultimately make contact with him and interview him. And then several years later, quite recently, someone I had met who runs a small press called Books, which is interested in publishing dissident French writers, just approached me and said, would you like to, translate a volume of Michéa's works in English? And I agreed, and that's how this book came about. And I'll just add, I mean, I'm sure this will be something that we get deeper into, that while I thought that Michéa was quite relevant when I wrote that first article for Dissent in around 2018 or so, and the reason why I thought Michéa was interesting at that time was, first of all, he clearly seemed connected to the phenomenon of populism, even if that's not exactly a word that he uses, to the extent that we were very involved in sort of that sort of first volley of populist politics around 2016, 2017. His work, even though he'd been writing for many years before that, seemed very much to be part of that moment. The other thing that appealed to me, or let me correct that interested me about him, and to some extent appealed to me, is the fact that he, defended this very sort of robust, left critique of contemporary society, and particularly the left, while being extremely critical of liberalism. So this kind of way that Michéa represented a sort of rupture between a certain conception of the left and liberalism struck me as something that was extremely interesting and maybe, to use the term that my friend had used years before, symptomatic, although now it's something quite different. And so that's what interested me. And then I would just say, in terms of what the present interest is, I mean, I don't think that my interest in Michéa is purely contextual, purely tied to sort of contemporary events. But it was very difficult for me not to think about Michéa in light of the 2024 election in the US, less because of, some kind of endless, or less because of some, critique of Donald Trump, which has just kind of completely consumed the American left for years and years now, for essentially entering a decade at this point. But precisely because of his critique of the left. He didn't specifically target the American Democratic Party. In fact, says relatively little about American politics in his work. But this kind of longstanding critique that he's had of the direction of the left seemed highly relevant in 2024 and seemed to kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of the problems of the Democratic Party, namely that it has increasingly become a party of urban, educated, relatively well-off people and has, to a significant extent, lost its traditional anchoring in a working class electorate. In many ways, that's one of the constant leitmotifs of Michéa's thought that just seemed highly relevant in 2024. So that's sort of a long history of my personal interest in Michéa. By the way, I'll just mention for your viewers that in addition to containing as you rightly said, a selection of Michéa's work, the final chapter is an interview that I did with Michéa specifically for this book in early 2025. So there's an interview in it that doesn't appear elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. And the intro you did, kind of summarizing his biography and his work. And so with Jean-Claude Michéa, he's not a thinker you would encounter in academia. So it is a unique person to pick up as a scholar and look at his work, because we're so used to, when it comes to French theory, these intellectuals like Foucault and the post-structuralists and people like that. You don't really get this type of view. And when it comes to what Michéa adds that's unique, maybe to just, if I were to summarize it, it's that it's not new for the left to critique liberalism, but usually the critique of liberalism is just that they aren't economically left enough, which is kind of the obvious critique from the left, or that they are in some case not authoritarian enough, which is the kind of Leninist, Maoist sort of critique.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing with leftist critiques of liberalism, because I was always critical of liberalism, but there's some leftist critiques that I feel like targeting the wrong thing sometimes, which is the institutions, like the idea of separation of powers or constitutional rights. And I'm thinking, whoa, 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 whoa. You see this on the right too, with a lot of these sort of post-liberal trajectories. They actually end up moving for a kind of dictatorial system. I think what makes Michéa interesting is he's simultaneously more pro-democracy than liberals are. He's coming at it
That's
from
right.
a sort of libertarian socialist perspective, but not libertarian in a social sense. That's what's unique about him. He likes Orwell, as one of the chapters is all about like the whole concept of Tory anarchism, which is a sort
Right.
of term that Orwell himself coined. Tory anarchist is a term he used to describe his views. And Michéa kind of, in some ways, could be characterized by that to a certain degree. I don't know about anarchist in a real sense, but definitely on the libertarian end. So unlike the leftists who just critique liberalism from the political or economic angle, he critiques it also from the social angle. And that's where I feel like that's a space that needs to have a discussion, because for Michéa, can't just look at liberalism as an ideology of capitalism only economically. Also, that social ideology, a lot of the progress we sometimes take as leftist views are themselves part of a superstructure, is itself as part of the superstructure of capitalism. And one excuse leftists that I hear in America and Canada use, especially in America, is whenever you critique the left, they'll say that those aren't leftists, these are liberals. The Democrats are liberals. And I hate this excuse because they always say, okay, if only we had a party, a real leftist party, then, our policies are popular. I think people should study France more, or just Europe, because Europe has had its fair share of failed leftist projects, and Michéa primarily writes about French politics. And yeah, France had various socialist parties come to power and heavily disappoint, and they have a rising far right. And you mentioned that he's very in touch with populism, even though he didn't use that term. I think what you might mean by that is, he's in touch with, I would say, for lack of a better term, the common people. And could that be because of his background? Because he's a high school teacher. He's not a ivory tower academic, and I would like you to go into his background a little bit, his kind of communist background, his family background, anti-fascist background, and all of that.
Sure. So that was a great, commentary on Michéa's work overall. So I can see you really read it and engaged it. Thank you. A couple things. I'll say a little bit about his background, and then I would like to make sure that we address an issue related to the term liberalism, because I think there's a few clarifications that have to be brought there. Again, everything you said is accurate, but some of these points hinge on a proper understanding of that term. So, and I'll just sort of say in full disclosure that I've never actually met Michéa in person, but we've had a fairly extensive correspondence, over the years. So I know him a little bit, I guess I would say. And he's talked about his past in his writings, and I was able to glean things from that. And I also wrote an article about him shortly coinciding with the appearance of this volume for the online magazine Compact, in which he actually answered some of my further questions about his life. So that article has some information about him. But the basics are that he's born in 1950. Perhaps the most striking fact about his background is that both his parents were communists, meaning that they were members of the French Communist Party. They, like many communists, played a significant role in the French resistance. I haven't looked very deeply into that, but there are certain websites, dedicated to people's role in the resistance, and I believe that his father does appear in some of those. And I think also, by the way, this is something that in itself is quite striking, and that Americans, at least, or North Americans, can tend to forget, is how important French communism was for a certain conception of the French idea of the nation and for French patriotism. The communists, which is not right, the sort of immediate association that we have with communists, needless to say, in the U.S. And of course, yes, they were doing this while still singing the International as the party's anthem, but they, in many ways, they saw themselves as kind of salt of the earth defenders of France against German occupation at a time when at least some elites were prepared to collaborate. Again, you got to be careful not to overgeneralize on either side, and it's worth noting that the communists did not initially participate in resistance. It was only after the invasion of the Soviet Union that they felt free to do so, but they did become active. And I think that mattered a lot to Michéa. He grew up in Paris, actually in what we would have to translate as housing projects. It's what the French call HLM, which basically means public housing. And he talks about sort of how important the life of the Communist Party was really to sort of his daily existence. A lot of the people who were his neighbors were fellow party members. The party, his his parents were employed by the party. His mother worked for the party news agency. His dad, and this is one of my favorite details about him, his dad was a reporter for L'Humanité, which was the party's daily newspaper at the time, but he was the sports reporter. So, the French Communist Party was kind of a big enough organization, and one that was so concerned with sort of creating a kind of counter society in post-war France that, the party had a, preoccupation and concern with sports, and Michéa's dad reported on it. He made trips to the Soviet Union and I think to other Eastern countries. What's interesting is that just as say, it would not be uncommon for people in the United States to sort of be deeply, to have a church play a significant role in their upbringing. The party played something kind of analogous to that in his, and there were many French people of that era that for whom that was the case. What's interesting to me in his reflections about all this is that it's his point is not, and therefore I became a diehard Marxist. I mean, he did a little bit, and he remains, very much an enthusiastic reader of Marx. I don't think that he really thinks of himself as a communist anymore, but he also has no anti-Marxism the way that a lot of sort of former communist intellectuals sometimes will. What sort of he really dwells upon. Yeah, that's right.
Communist sympathizer.
That's right. But
Right.
he has this, what sort of appeals to, or what he reflects on when he thinks about his upbringing, which I do think is quite important for him, is that communism was a kind of world. It was a kind of milieu. If I wanted to use, a sort of slightly fancy social science terms, it was very much a kind of, what the Germans call Gemeinschaft, in the sense of a kind of community that has a kind of face-to-face quality with regular interactions, forms of mutual aid, people who kind of keep up in touch with each other, look out for each other, and all these kinds of things. And even, and he talks about that's really what mattered to him in terms of his communist upbringing, and the way that he describes it is that he was, part of a community, and one that he thinks would not have been the same kind of community without its connections to the working class. Yes, his dad was going into a newspaper office and writing articles for a paper, but there was, in terms of like, youth organizations and, party cell meetings and things like that, there was a real connection to working class. And side note, Paris was a city that still had working class neighborhoods at that time in a way that, it would, in a way that's less and less the case at the time. So, eventually he goes to the Sorbonne, he goes to the University of Paris, studies philosophy. He makes a choice not to go into an academic route. And he eventually, though, qualifies to be a high school teacher. And it's this very distinctly French sort of profession that one has in high schools that most other countries don't have, which is that of a philosophy teacher. Since the 19th century, for various reasons, but particularly tied to the birth of the French Republic, especially the Third Republic in the late 1800s, which is very responsible for the creation of the public school system. There was this idea that sort of the pinnacle of one's high school education should be a year spent studying philosophy. It's not the only thing you study, but it's the only time you take the philosophy class. It's only offered in what's called terminale, which is essentially the equivalent of 12th grade, at the end of which you take this exam called the baccalaureate. So it's this very sort of peculiarly, sort of French tradition.
They still do that, right? You have to
they
learn,
do.
take at least, yeah, because so I grew up in Canada, and one of my friends went to this private school that was in French, and he's son of immigrants, and they sent him to a French-speaking school, and he had a very unique experience from the rest of us because he got to study philosophy mandatory. It was mandatory, and
That's
that
right.
shocked me because for me it was an elective. It was one of the smallest classes ever. I loved it, but it's shocking that that's not at all. Like history wasn't even mandatory for me. I had to
Right.
take. I had to volunteer to take it.
Well, the way it works in France, and this goes back again to these, these education laws of the late 1800s, which really are extremely important for French history, very important for the French conception of the Republic. The Republic is strongly associated with education and especially public education. And I think it's very important. This system is very important for Michéa's life as well. The thing about it is that what determines the whole educational system is this state-sponsored end of high school exam called the baccalaureate. So even if you go to a private school, essentially private schools on their own can't really issue a degree. I mean, in other words, you don't really get credit just for finishing. The completion of high school is associated with successfully passing the baccalaureate. So what that means is that even private schools that hire their own teachers and have their own, funding and so on are still kind of under the hegemony, you might say, of, the state system. So they have to offer the philosophy class anyway. So, so Michéa spent his whole career as, obviously a civil servant in France, as a philosophy high school teacher. And though he grew up in Paris, he did most of his career in Montpellier, which is a town in the southwest of France. And the way that he tells it, it was only kind of accidentally that he actually got into writing. He claims to not especially enjoy writing. And like you mentioned his Orwell essay, that was the first little pamphlet that he wrote. I think it was around 94, 95 that he was asked to sort of publish, and it became a little bit of a kind of underground hit, and he continued to write and became this. I mean, underground's not quite the word because he did have a significant, major publisher, but, he became, popular in certain sort of political circles. And that's, that's how he became Michéa. And then the final thing I'll just mention, so that we've covered his life is, I don't know exactly at what point this was, but he retired. He's in his early 70s now, and he lives on a farm. And every time that I get an email from him, there's pictures of his farm and farm life kind of attached to the email, and he and his wife are deep into this farm, and again, I think somewhere in southwestern France. So anyway, that's his life. I don't know if you want to go into the question of liberalism now, or whichever direction. I'm fine with whatever direction you want to take.
I think for liberalism, Orwell, because there's two
Sure.
very
That's right.
counterintuitive aspects of Michéa's thought. One is this, you could say conservative leftism, conservative socialism. Maybe you could say small c conservative, but the Orwell is kind of a guide to that because Orwell was was someone who also had these kind of idiosyncratic views. I mean, many people in America who are usually just taught his works as, anti-communist literature,
Right.
and they don't learn about his own views as a democratic socialist. That itself is not that widely known, and even among the people who do know his views, the kind of conservative component of Orwell's views is also not. And it's weird because there's a lot of mythology that I've seen come out of kind of neo-communist circles that are they very much dislike Orwell because Orwell
Right.
himself was a big critic of communism. And it is interesting that it's not surprising to me that Michéa would, despite growing up in these communist circles, be very critical of actually existing communism and gravitate to Orwell because, I mean, you alluded to it, the the resistance wasn't really the communists weren't actually able to resist the fascists until the invasion of the Soviet Union because they had the
Right.
pact. So like the
Right.
Soviet Union kept its pact even as, the Nazis were at war with Britain and then France. So it's
Sure.
really, I mean, there's all kind of things that disillusioned communists away from Soviet style Marxism, and he has his reasons for rejecting that while still being very much a person who's sympathetic to communist ideals. Orwell, Tory anarchist. What does that mean? How does Michéa, I want to say reinterpret, or rather illuminate Orwell's actual views?
Let me just first say a quick comment on the anti-communist thing. One thing I'll just sort of point out is I definitely think that Michéa was critical of really existing socialism and critical of the direction of the French Communist Party. He did actually leave the French Communist Party, I believe, at some point in the 70s. However, he never made that big a deal of his critique of communism, and I think that that is in itself significant. Not to somehow suggest that he is really deep down, in fact, a communist or is kind of okay with communism. I don't think that's true, and that's not the point. But it is striking that particularly that there have been several realms in French intellectual life in the 20th century of
Mm,
strong critiques of communism,
right.
particularly among former
Yeah.
leftist intellectuals. There's a kind of whole sort of, I mean, in France and elsewhere, kind of a 56 moment,
Like
and then
socialism or barbarism, that group, right? Like
yeah, then
Claude
there's the
Lafleur
sort of
and
eternal
Castoriadis.
Trotskyism,
Yeah.
but there's particularly a strong moment, and some scholars have written about this, and some people just still remember it because it wasn't all that long ago. In the early 70s, a number of former student radicals became extremely critical, not just of communism, but also of Marxism, which they insisted on connecting. There's a group called the Nouveau Philosophe, the Nouveau Philosophers, Bernard-Henri Lévy, André Glucksmann, and a few others. Foucault was actually quite close to them and sympathetic with that movement. And they sort of took advantage of the publication of Solzhenitsyn's works during that period to essentially kind of make a strong case that Marxism was hopelessly connected to totalitarianism. And I'm sort of punting on the validity of those remarks, but just to say that there's this kind of very sort of strongly emphasized, dramatized kind of anti-Marxism that you sometimes have in France, where people sort of announce, I can no longer be a Marxist, and kind of noisily slam the door. And Michéa doesn't do any, right? And I think that is, and it's probably more tied to sort of his connection with the left. Again, that doesn't, my point is not that
Right. Yeah, yeah.
that he's in fact okay with communism. I don't think
Yeah,
that's true.
no, yeah.
I think his point was that there, I mean, long story short, I think he sees this as sort of closely connected with his big theme, which is the way that he thinks that the left has sort of, severed its ties with any kind of working class culture. And that's really the concern for him. But sorry about, and I think that actually in some ways does have a lot to do in a certain sense with his interest in Orwell. So Tory
Yeah,
anarchists.
I was about to say that, yeah, 'cause
Yeah.
if he's interested in Orwell, that suggests a kind of big critique of communism, but at the same time, he is very critical of the New Left, and, I
That's
think that
right.
was yeah, so that's what made him not join that kind of tendency, I think, part of it.
I think that's right, and I mean, so there's a lot of things to say about his interest in Orwell. The, I mean, here I think is, the specific phrase that Michel likes to use from time to time is he says that there is no, and I forget what term exactly he uses, but no sort of working class movement or revolutionary movement or leftist movement that does not have its conservative moment. That is the specific phrase that he uses. And I think that, and we can get into this, but he, on the one hand, was totally fine with the title that I gave to this volume, but also kind of emphasized that it's not quite what he says. So it was funny that he was totally fine with it, but intended to sort of slightly, I don't disagree with it. I mean, here, so in other words, he is interested in the fact that he that people do not give sufficient credit to the idea that leftist movements can't be 100% revolutionary all the time, that occasionally they have to engage in sort of protecting what they have achieved. And that is what he calls, a conservative moment. I think sort of in a French context, talking about sort of, forms of labor rights and social welfare achievements might be examples of that. But, I think to really understand his interest in Orwell, he uses that phrase Tory anarchist, but in a sense, he doesn't completely really develop either of those. Michéa does not really develop either of those terms that much. What interests him is Orwell's socialism and Orwell's conception of socialism. And, the key, that key definition or the key moment in Orwell's work when he sort of describes his political orientation is when he defines socialism, when he says socialism is common decency. Socialism is common decency. And I think that is the crux of Michéa's reading of Orwell, and in a sense, kind of the philosophical foundation of Michéa's thought and the themes of his essays. So just to unpack that a little bit, I think that if I remember correctly, I didn't double check this, so apologize if I'm getting this wrong. I believe that you find that definition in Orwell's famous essay, The Road to Wigan Pier, which is, in a sense, if you really want to understand what Orwell really thinks, is arguably the key text. And it's very interesting to read that and then read things like 1984 and Animal Farm, especially 1984, in light of that. And, the Road to Wigan Pier is in part about Orwell's kind of direct sort of encounter with the working class of Great Britain in the 1930s. There's these famous scenes where he meets, miners who actually take him down into the mines. And there's some he has some extraordinary writing and descriptions of that. But then there's also this kind of polemic that he has with contemporary socialism. And it's, when you think about sort of recent discussions about the orientation of the left, they are sort of surprisingly relevant. And in particular, Orwell is very much concerned by this point about, can the left win, bring over working class people who are tempted by fascism, and he's specifically thinking about sort of, the, fascist tendencies in British culture in the 1930s. And he has this kind of interesting argument, is that one of the reasons why the working class doesn't like socialism is because they don't like socialists, and he talks about these kind of, ways in which, it's actually quite mean. It's sort of fairly engaging, but it's, there's a kind of bitterness to Orwell's description. He says, that he basically is trying to say that a lot of the people who are drawn to socialism, first of all, are people who are drawn to a lot of kind of niche middle class causes, so he says, they tend to come from, I forget the exact word in British culture, but nonconformist Christianity. They tend to be teetotalers. They're vegetarians. I think he actually describes them as sandal wearing, at a certain kind of point. And that's the first kind of critique. So his argument is that there's a strong tendency in socialism, which is no longer working class, and has become sort of embraced by a certain elements of the British middle class, which is something, that Orwell was always fascinated with. He has this famous line about how he comes from, I forget what it is, but from, the lowest stratum of the English upper class or something, of the upper middle class or something like that, all these kind of like fine gradations. The other thing that he says that socialism has become fundamentally kind of an obsession with order. It's people who sort of look at society and think it's a bit untidy, and are sort of obsessed with wanting to sort of try to arrange it a little bit more neatly. And so the interesting and that
Social
in that
engineering. The social
yeah,
like
that's
the
I
this
think
idea
that's
of
social
socially
engineering,
engineering people, yeah.
but it's less maybe sort of a first order critique of social engineering itself as the mindset that is drawn to it. That makes sense. There's certain kinds of people who like the idea of changing culture because they don't like
Right.
the way it is spontaneously. And if you think about it, what
Yeah.
what's interesting, and Michéa is very clear about this in his own reading of Orwell, is you start to, I mean, it becomes kind of clear that in many ways a book like 1984 is less sort of a particular critique of ideological communism or socialism for that matter than it is a critique of the intellectuals, that and of the kind of roles that intellectuals play in politics. I mean, the most striking example being of this kind of, desire to sort of make things that work pretty well spontaneously work better according to some sort of abstract and fairly arbitrary code is newspeak. The language of Oceania or whatever it's called in the state in which the main character lives in 1984.
Mm.
And
Oceania.
this, yeah, and in a sense, kind of, what I think that that there's what this allows Michéa to do, and I think it's fairly well founded, is to sort of show that there's a way in which we can read 1984 actually not really as a critique of what we commonly think of as left culture, but as of a certain kind of role that intellectuals or middle class intellectuals have come to play in 20th century politics. And this is interesting because it ultimately ties, into Michéa's argument that, at some point in recent history, this has kind of been the fate of many sort of left parties, is that they have become parties of intellectuals and prioritizing both the concerns of intellectuals and ensuring that it's intellectuals who occupy premier leadership places in these organizations. And that is very much Michéa's critique, but in a certain way, a reading of Orwell sort of allows you to do it. But just if I can, please stop me, but just, the thing that, though, I mean, I want to make sure, though, that we say something about common decency, because in a sense, I was kind of talking
Oh, of
about sort of
course. That's a
the,
huge part of it, this idea of
yeah, I
common.
mean, in a sense, what I've
Yeah.
been saying about the intellectuals and newspeak and, the sandal wearing vegetarians that Orwell talks about in Wig and Peer is sort of, for Orwell, those are all cautionary tales of what happens when socialism loses its roots in the working class. And in a sense, kind of the essence of sort of Orwell's view, Michéa fully embraces, is that working people, because of the way of life that they live, because of their social status, because of their income levels, and because of the kind of work that they do, gravitate towards a form of kind of mutual aid and a kind of spontaneous ethics that he calls common decency. And the key thing is that Michéa and Orwell both take this very seriously and believe it to be real, right? This is kind of what is striking and sort of flies in the face of a whole kind of tendency of sort of French post-structuralism, in which everything is a linguistic construct, or a representation. That's not what they're saying. They're saying that this is actually sort of a real characteristic of this people. And by the way, there's this whole sort of subplot. I reread 1984 this past summer for the first time in a while, and I think the first time since I've really been engaging with Michéa. And it's very sort of striking the way that there's this whole sort of subplot about the so-called proles in 1984 Oceania, that and it's very, that, and they're considered to be sort of, uneducated and regressive, and and dirty and all this kind of stuff. And they're precisely seen this way by the members of the party, who allegedly are sort of ruling this kind of worker state, so the way that there's actually this kind of class tension in there, I think is very important. And in a sense, what Michéa and Orwell argue is, that this common decency is a real characteristic of working class culture and working class communities. The example that Orwell also gives that definition of socialism as common decency, I believe, in a little essay that he writes on Charles Dickens, whom Orwell considers to be great, which was also kind of a bit provocative in an age of, literary modernism, that this kind of sort of stodgy sort of Victorian writer was praised by Orwell. And he has this line in there, and I'm not getting this exactly right, but the gist of it is, common decency is the instinct that makes a jury give money to the family of a child who was, run over in the street by a rich man. It's that kind of sort of moral instinct. The one that always struck, the example that Michéa gives, and this is in the interview and the book you mentioned, Toward the Conservative Left, that stands out to me is he talks about the way in which, working class people will lend cars to each other when someone's car breaks down, and there's actually sort of an instance in which in the past couple of years, I live in rural North Carolina where I teach, and saw some version of this, and I was kind of struck by it, whereas this kind of thing would not really sort of be, well, let me correct that, would very much not be this of sort of like the professorial cast, would really lend cars to each other. But, and Michéa has this account of it. He says, well, it has to do with people who are used to being sort of on the low end of the income scale, maybe not people who are dirt poor, but who struggle to make ends meet. He also thinks it has to do with something about the concreteness of forms of manual labor. And so it's very, very sort of important to sort of Michéa's idea that there is a kind of set of values which he thinks are kind of sort of, constantly use the phrase anthropological. He thinks they are kind of, fundamental human values of mutual assistance, of protecting people in danger, helping out people who are in times of distress and things like this, or facing just hard times, that he thinks really kind of only manifest themselves in working class culture. And somewhere in there's a kind of argument that, once upon a time, most of humanity was living something close to kind of a version like this. And that the nature of sort of modern society is really to kind of remove people from the communities that nurture common decency. And this is how in sort of the Orwell / Michéa account, you get modernity, which of which capitalism, of course, is a sort of crucial element, but it's not just capitalism either, right? So and he's not the kind of writer who ever sort of has a kind of like neat narrative to explain all this. It's more sort of something that we learn about through his various kind of polemics. Although the essay that you've mentioned, the unity of liberalism, or that about the unity of liberalism is the closest that he comes to that. But the narrative is something kind of like, once upon a time, there are working class communities founded on common decency, and the problem of modernity is the various forces that remove us, that sort of extract us from those communities, and that make the values associated with those communities either at minimum no longer self-evident, and at worst, repellent, and that's, I think there's a kind of concern in Michéa somehow that, common decency should be regarded with a kind of suspicion by, at least by certain kind of contemporary sort of left circles. So that
A lot of left circles, yeah, they see common sense
that's the
as
Orwell angle
true.
to Michéa, I would say. And this common decency element is really, really important to all of Michéa's thought.
Yeah, and that connects to that populist angle, which is, something you hear populists say, even if it's just demagogically not really genuine, they'll say, this is just common sense. We need to respect common sense. And there is a real sense, Michéa would say that there is a rationale to common sense. It's not just like
That's right.
a superstition that is brainwashed as a result of bourgeois ideology or relics of feudal ideology and something that just needs to be socially engineered away from people. And that's something that very much, as I recall, was present in Orwell's critique of, the kind of fictional party that takes over and establishes the
Right.
totalitarian state. They regard the proles as these people that just need to be controlled. And maybe to clarify,
And whose values are threatening, right? Because they're against these kind of technocratic values that the party is promoting, in this kind of ridiculous language, that they're trying to kind of promote at the same time. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's in the sense that the kind of socialism Orwell and Michéa are critical of is socialism that's state centric, that sees society as a threat that needs to be engineered, whereas they see socialism as something that needs to be rooted in society. In a certain sense, you could say that is more in line with actual Marx, but that's a whole other debate in itself, and where you could say Lenin maybe departs from that. But
Right.
like that's a different debate. With regard to, some of what you were talking about, some of the things you were talking about with Michéa's thought, I want to clarify for the audience because some people might think that the narrative you're talking about is like some kind of noble savage myth, which is not Michéa's. I wouldn't say
Yeah.
it's Michéa's argument in the sense that he thinks there is human nature, even if it evolves, but
Right.
that doesn't mean it's all good. And I think the noble savage myth is more present in like people who sometimes get really into anthropology and they gravitate to only like the good parts of human nature. They'll look at the egalitarian aspects of various indigenous societies, ignore all the things like xenophobia. So they'll say, oh, human nature is inherently egalitarian. It's like, well, that might be true. But also there's the hierarchical component. There's also the xenophobic component, which is, tribes might be internally egalitarian, but externally afraid of the other. And you know what? There's a rationale for that because you don't know
Right.
if you don't know about what the other tribe is bringing, they could just kill you. It's like there's a lot of rationale to like kind of evolved prejudices, if you will, or evolved sense, this common sense. And that doesn't mean, like the quote unquote masses. It's a term I don't really like, but it doesn't mean they're like correct about everything or there's this wisdom of the crowd. It's that a lot of what it socialists like is good about socialism has to come out of people voluntarily and it's already there. It's not something you need to like teach them how to do.
That's right.
Whereas I
That's
think
right.
what
Or at
context,
least at minimum, that's Michéa's position. That's what I'm saying, right? I mean, I
right.
I
Yeah.
think,
Exactly. Yeah. And the context that Orwell is writing and is one of the managerial revolution, because Orwell also has an interesting relationship to James Burnham, who wrote
Right.
that book. Actually, in many ways, you could look at like Orwell and Burnham as people who diagnosed similar problems, except Orwell stayed a socialist, a democratic socialist, whereas Burnham became a neoconservative. He would turn very
Right.
heavily to the right.
But
In this
Michéa's
context of
very, very. Sorry, go ahead.
oh yeah, I've been critical of Burnham. Yeah. That's why I'm
But
kind of
he also
juxtaposing them.
says 1984 is actually, he has this fascinating essay in one of his, or remark in one of his essays on Orwell, where he says, really what 1984 is about is a society premised on Burnham's managerial revolution. That it's actually, that's really what's going on, much more than, Stalin or anything like that. So.
Well, yeah, in Stalin and Hitler, as well as in some senses the trajectory of state capitalism, social democracy, had this tendency of elitism. Like, and part of why Orwell seems like he's dismissive of socialism, it's not necessarily this sort of, stereotypical boomer take that like socialism is just this fantasy for
That's right.
out of touch young intellectuals. It's more because Orwell went to Spain, right, and fought with the anarchists and was very supportive of the anarchists in Spain, and has explicitly endorsed democratic socialism, but was critical of socialism in Britain. From what I recall in the Road to Wigan Pier, the critique is of particularly Marxism. So, like the Marxist-Leninist Bolsheviks, who the Party of Great Britain was actually following Moscow's lead. It was part of the Communist International. And he's also critical of the Fabian socialists. They were sort of like the moderate social democrats, except they were very statist as well. They would be more democratic compared to like Bolsheviks, more moderate, but they still had a very state-centric component of socialism built on like top-down planning, as well as, stuff like eugenics. There's all that whole legacy of statist progressivism. So he's critical of both of those things. And that's when he's talking about like socialists not being rooted in the working class, that's where that comes from, because that was a reality. Because the critique Orwell often gets from Marxists is, well, if he was really a socialist, how come he was so critical of socialism? And it's like, well, it's critical of that.
Yes. I mean, I think that's all exactly right. Yeah, I think it was also in Spain that Orwell encountered, Soviet communism
Oh, yeah.
too, and that he sort of saw, basically, I think he saw the communists as kind of, screwing over the, I don't know how you pronounce it, POUM,
The POUM, yeah.
the anarchist organization that Orwell was fighting for, the Spanish anarchist organization that he was fighting for. I think that's exactly right. And, there's a chapter that I have in the translation where it's this exchange of letters that Michéa has with a sort of French left of center scholar, a sort of historian of socialism named Jacques Julial. And it's interesting to me that I can't remember how much he actually talks about the term socialism per se in that, but Michéa very much tries to distinguish the history of working class movements and working class organization from what we call the left. And he tries to make this sort of hard case that really these two things are kind of, fundamentally different. I mean, he makes this argument, I haven't double checked this, that Marx never in any of his writings uses the term left, or at least something like that.
Yeah.
And so his point is that there's, what there really is a history of working class, organizations and, coming out of the Industrial Revolution, et cetera. And he makes this kind of interesting argument that at least in France, that it's not until the Dreyfus affair of the 1890s, this sort of famous moment when a French Jewish military officer was accused of selling military secrets to the Germans, was falsely accused, and this became sort of a big, national sort of controversy, with sort of the emerging kind of nationalist right saying Dreyfus was guilty, and a kind of broad human rights left saying that he was innocent. And interestingly, I mean, Michéa is actually, I don't want to say necessarily critical of that moment, but certainly not as celebratory as many people are towards it, because he argues that this is kind of the moment when you see the emergence of a left as this kind of broad coalition of people that's concerned with things like democracy and human rights, and that it has little to do with a defense of sort of working class culture and working class needs and working class, priorities. So he does sort of, and by the way, this guy Julial that he opposes sort of quite strongly disagrees with it, because he thinks there's always been more of a sort of deeper connection, I guess you could say, between the sort of bourgeois left and, the working class elements of socialism, whereas, Michéa sort of takes quite seriously these kind of, socialist theories that have sort of emphasized a certain kind of separatism of working class culture vis-a-vis sort of modern politics and the modern left, and I think it comes down to this idea that, those sort of common decency instincts are going to sort of dissolve and decay if it becomes associated with sort of more bourgeois concerns. So this is the reason also why, he does not think that the left he does not think that working class issues have ever really been sort of tied to liberalism, to bring that word.
Hmm. Well, do you think when you talk about working class culture, would it be safe to say that the common decency, it's really common culture? The way I think of it is back maybe in the 20th century, it made more sense to speak of common culture as working class culture, whereas now there's kind of a more complex, layered class society with the professional managerial class,
Sure.
right? But I like to think of the common culture as sort of like a distinction between elite and non-elite. And from there's many different types of elites. It's not straightforward. Like there's
Yeah.
capitalists, but also like education, right? I mean, going to, a very prestigious school does distinguish one quite significantly, not just in terms of social capital, but in their prospects compared to, a person without a college degree or even a masters and whatnot. So it's like this kind of common distinction, I think, is very important because the fact that a lot of the left comes out of the academy is part of why they are more alienated. They're more like out of touch with like a lot of common sensibilities. And also that there's this other relationship where people who get attracted to communism are people who are alienated from the common culture. And that's, I think, always been a kind of paradox. One that I think is kind of inevitable with fringer ideologies. I think people forget that like even fascism before it became mainstream started off as a kind of crazy youth movement. It was largely driven by youth, a bunch of young thugs, really. And
Some of them socialists.
Yeah, a lot of them former socialists, right? And in any case, what I thought was, so this is what I think is really interesting: the social engineering component and how it ties into common sense, because this is where we get into like what conservative means in this towards a conservative left idea. Because look, this is something I encounter when I talk to a lot of radical leftists. They'll say, okay, maybe to win. So either they push like a cultural revolution and economic revolution. They believe you need a transformation of gender, masculinity, marriage, everything. I mean, this was very present in early communism. It was always a tension, right? Family abolition and ideas like this. With some leftists who have accepted even that, like, that's not gonna, work as a selling point, there's still this latent assumption, right? Yeah, well, like a lot of these traditional values, we know we have to get rid of that, right? And I kind of think, well, which ones and why? Why this assumption that everything that is common is, something that, because it's rooted in this idea that people don't actually have their own common sense. They're bestowed it by their overlords. Like this is the capitalist ideology, the feudal ideology.
Education. You have to be educated, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you need to educate everything away. And I think it makes sense why Michéa is very critical of the left's take on the left's position on immigration, because a lot of people on the left will either just dismiss the very idea of thinking it is mass immigration's a problem. They think it's the only way you could possibly oppose it is if you're just like a bigot or a racist, and that it's something that people won't care about as long as there was some kind of wealth redistribution and whatever. Like this, it's just like, or they're brainwashed by the right. That's my favorite talking point. They like to say this is just a moral panic, as opposed to something that kind of does arise and maybe that the propaganda is speaking to rather than creating it. What do you think about that, and how does this tie into the conservative left? Because Michéa is not calling for a theocracy or J.D. Vance type of politics, because people get scared when they hear the word conservative, especially progressive
Sure.
types.
No. And that again is, I think that's why he liked the title, is mainly just because he thought that it would kind of piss people off. I think he thought it was provocative. But I mean, there's a lot of really great and important things in what you just said. I'll try and just sort of make a couple of comments. So first, just to sort of go back a little bit, I mean, you made this comment that he's not exactly sort of celebrating the noble savage, and I would say not exactly, right? I mean, in other words, he may actually come closer to that kind of argument than many intellectuals these days are comfortable with. I don't think that it's specifically the noble savage tradition, because I mean, especially because that's very sort of connected to certain theories of individualism and things like that, and sort of 17th and 18th century political thought. But it's very interesting that, one of the important references in Michéa's work, less than Orwell and Lasch, we need to get to, is Marcel Mauss, this early 20th century French anthropologist, who's tied to, the sort of invention of sociology and modern anthropology by Emil Durkheim, and who's perhaps best known for this essay on the gift, and the idea of gift giving as a sort of primal form of sociality, and as a recognition that exchange is one of the sort of core elements of of human social interaction, and really kind of by extension of human nature. And I think that sort of, one of the sort of the theoretical, I suppose, significance you could say that Michéa gives to working class culture. I think there's also just a lot of, fondness for it on his part. But the theoretical significance is that I think he believes that it sort of instantiates this kind of, anthropological tendency that people like Mauss, identified, that, that humans sort of try to kind of, build social relations on various forms of exchange, mutual aid, etc. So how does this relate then to? So I do think there's very much a kind of theory of human nature that's connected to those ideas that underpins his work. But how does this connect to the conservative issue? And this really is where sort of the Lasch piece kind of comes in, Christopher Lasch piece, which is the critique of progress. And I don't think that is the whole story on Michéa's possible conservatism or conservative elements, but I think it's a big part of it, because because what progress ultimately becomes for Michéa is the attempt to establish society and other principles besides common decency. And his argument is that, at least in a sort of Western context, the main ideology, the main sort of system for overcoming, traditional society with its rootedness in common decency is liberalism. I mean, progress and liberalism for him are interchangeable, I think, or at least they mutually imply one another. And what is liberalism then for him? It is when you try to establish social relations on other principles than exchange and common decency. And these tend to be sort of more abstract, and, to use a slightly fancy term, sort of proceduralist conceptions, for example, of justice, than you have in a traditional society, right? So the emphasis is not on sort of extol or that individuals are not supposed to exemplify sort of virtues or personal warmth or things like that. They're supposed to follow correct procedures, right? That's what the importance of following the law is. And liberalism for Michéa is fundamentally connected to, two modern institutions of the state and the market. And so that's his kind of story is, again, how liberalism becomes sort of the vehicle for extracting us from common decency. And Michéa's argument is, again, along the lines of what you said earlier, that we need to, that there is something that these traditional societies get right that needs to be defended. And that's the conservative element. And I do also think that in terms of its present significance, there is this kind of way in which Michéa is saying that the people who just don't get this are those who belong to the left, because they are so sort of hell-bent on this kind of idea of progress and a certain conception of liberalism, whereas certain conservatives and maybe even certain figures on sort of, the populist right actually do have some kind of, intuitive understanding of these issues that the left does not.
Right. They're better at lying to people and understanding people.
That's right.
Part of it, yeah.
But somehow tapping into something that is emotionally
right.
meaning.
Well, they understand.
Right. It's not, to go back to your phrase, and I think we agree in this, it's not simply brainwashing, right? It's manipulative, but it's not.
Yeah, they can read society's unconscious. They can read society's
Right.
unconscious and
Something
work with
like
it as it is. So I think a good way in which, I think a way to tie into Lasch, a good way to explain how Lasch ties into Michéa's thinking is this notion of socialization, because the conception a lot of leftists have is this idea that, like, what is common sense is shaped by the cultural hegemony of the mode of production, and that the ideologies people harbor, their common sense, as a way to reproduce capitalism. But the way someone like Christopher Lasch sees it is almost kind of the inverse, which is that a lot of traditions, a lot of cultural practices, a lot of just simple things like the family itself, right? Particularly the extended family, but even the nuclear family, which he saw as kind of a degeneration of the extended family, but still was kind of a haven in a heartless world. A lot of things like, traditions are sort of like barriers to capital's commodification of everyday life. I mean, the most obvious example of this is, you could say, sexuality, right? Lifting taboos makes it a lot more easy for capitalism to monetize all kind of things, to
Absolutely.
advertise. And so Lash's critique of the left, right, is with the left who embraced the kind of cultural turn of the 60s, this idea of deconstructing social norms. And the presumption is, if you deconstruct the norms that hold society together, it'll collapse, and then maybe you can have a revolution against capitalism. He thought, no, this is backwards. Because if you aren't socialized by things like the family, which, might have patriarchal elements, it might have oppressive elements, it might have taboos and whatnot, and stuff that, the libertines don't like. Some things that I think, rightfully they might not like. There's debate in there as to, like, which fence is worth keeping, which ones to tear down. But he's skeptical of the idea that, this assumption that the fence is bad, because he thinks that when the fence is gone, what's there to socialize people? Capitalism. Because capitalism, when it, that's what shapes social life. So if you don't have these kind of, pre-liberal, pre-modern ideas, traditions, what you will just get that socializes people is capitalist culture. And now, what is the most, I think, demonstrable example of that is the urban-rural divide. What I've always found very interesting is how the smaller the town, the smaller the city even, but particularly like smaller towns, villages, more rural areas, you find more communistic, for lack of a better term, communistic, habits and behaviors. Like, people will just,
That's right.
be very hospitality. People will be very polite to you. People will share things. They'll, do favors for each other. There's a sort of solidarity. In cities, it's where, you can't even look at a stranger the wrong way. It's weird to even want to talk to strangers. There's a lack of solidarity, a low trust society. Yet it seems to be that, like, the cities are the places that are the most socially progressive. And it's, it wasn't always the case that the rural areas were anti-socialist. In fact, in Canada, they used to be the strongholds where the, Socialist Party, the CCF, was biggest. It's the opposite now. They've, been shifting kind of against liberals and the left. So how does one explain this paradox, right? And how does one explain that where the left seems to only be having popularity now is these big cities, which in practice are very not communistic? And I think it has to do with this question of socialization and, you could say the common sensibilities of ordinary people that's rooted, you could say rooted in a human nature. It makes sense why Marcel Mauss is a big influence on Michéa because, the gift, right? I mean, this is David Graeber talks about this a lot. Noam Chomsky talks about this a lot. And I think they in some ways embody the kind of view that you might say is like closer to the noble savage myth.
Sure.
It's closer to that than the technocratic conception of subjectivity, but it's definitely not like noble savage. It's not like I guess you could say noble savage in the Rousseauian sense or in the liberal colonial sense.
I mean, again, first of all, just I really enjoyed what you said, and I think that really, your remarks sort of perfectly capture the precisely Michéa is talking about, admittedly in a more French context, but I think this is his analysis of the world in which we and I think your comments are, absolutely consistent with what he's saying. It's a recurring theme in Michéa, the way in which paradoxically, it's these inherited habits associated with older and often more rural ways of life that are sort of the biggest kind of barriers against the advance of modernity, but also capitalism. One of my favorite ones, it's not really about rural culture per se, although in certain contexts it could be, is he talks about sort of French schools as a kind of site of memory. And, this is I think the second or third chapter in the book, from this little essay that he wrote that was kind of critiquing education reform tendencies in the 90s and early 2000s in France, which are very similar to what happened in the US. But in a nutshell, like one of the things he's talking about though is what he likes about sort of the old school. And he said, yeah, I know schools in modernity have always had something to do with educating capitalist workforce, et cetera. But he said, they also taught things like Latin, and there's a side, and of course you could say, yes, that's bourgeois culture and all that. But there's moments when Michéa says that, that somehow these kind of represent holdovers from the past that sort of, I don't know, embodied a kind of aspiration to culture that was really kind of deeply out of sync with sort of the motivations of a capitalist system. He also talks about, the authority that teachers have. It used to pre-May 68, the teachers sort of sat on this kind of, their desk was kind of on a little sort of stage in the front of class. And so, which also suggests that he thinks that certain forms of socialization go hand in hand with a degree of authority. I mean, not anything oppressive and tyrannical, founded on exchange and upholding sort of communal standards, like you said. But I do think it's interesting the way that throughout his work, you find this kind of praise of the way that of the way in which traditions work to the advantage of common people, and he seeks to emphasize the importance of that insight. In terms of sort of what happened, I mean, I think you're right. I think socialization, I hadn't really thought about that, and I'm not sure it's something that he strongly emphasizes in his own writings. But
I think it's in the I do see it actually pretty strongly in the chapter.
maybe
It was a society's unconscious. It was the
Yes,
one.
I actually did. I was
Yeah.
just thinking as you said that might be the exception, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is his, I mean, which he occasionally delves into. And I included that essay precisely for that reason, because he talks about, I mean, his going to help me remember this, but what I recall from that is, this kind of emphasis. I mean, it's actually kind of him using, a version of some Freudian ideas, which of course Lasch does as well, which is the idea that, part of the purpose of socialization is to create a functioning ego. Obviously, there's the superego too, but at least a functioning ego, which involves the capacity to renounce the pleasure principle, right? To sort of and that this actually is sort of crucial to a certain kind of conception of social order. It's not. I mean, yes, it involves repression, of course, as we know from reading Freud, but it also is the condition under which society can function. And
Right. Yeah.
and I do think I do think that along with a number of kind of contemporary of maybe a few other thinkers, Michéa is sort of very kind of concerned by the way in which capitalism is sort of destructive of the ego, is destructive of those tendencies that we acquire through socialization of being able
authority.
to, yeah. But the key thing, right? Because there's always this sort of threat of the superego, and got to be careful. You should be scared of the superego. That's the whole point of the superego. But
But it's changed
yeah,
forms.
it's something that worries Freud, right? In many ways, more that you kind of unleash the sort of superego. The point being is that, and again, maybe there's something actually vaguely idealistic in it, but that a proper form of socialization should precisely kind of wean us off of an excessive need for authority, because
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
eventually the ego becomes the parent, right? You don't need to
Well,
have
that's
this kind
that's what I
of
mean by authority. Like
right.
authority in the sense of like literally just as you mentioned, the professor having more authority before, or
That's
like
right.
the parent having authority. Because having authority in civil society with codependent institutions and societal structures, communities, that makes society less reliant on like a state as an authority,
Exactly.
right? And that's kind of why, like, we like to explain
Absolutely.
like this sort of
It's the
Tory
condition of
anarchism.
possibility of a certain kind of anarchism, right? I mean
Yeah. Well, I was
sorry.
about because like the Tory anarchism seems like kind of it seems counterintuitive, but I would say like the only actually existing anarchism is Tory anarchism in the sense that if you look at all the places where anarchism has thrived and actually sustained itself, unless it's been crushed by invaders or something, it's had a kind of somewhat it had a either like a cultural homogeneity or a social conservative element for today's standards. Like in the case of Rojava, for example, today, I know it's not anarchist, but it's libertarian socialist. It's bounded by Kurdish culture, and they're you
I
know
see.
it surprised people quite how austere they are, and they have a strong work ethic and you know social taboos and all that kind of stuff. In Catalonia, there was like a common Catalan culture. There was also there's this sort of austerity, right? Because if you don't have a state imposing order, I mean, people impose order themselves as a community. Whereas there's this kind of Starbucks anarchism, like
That's right.
kind of that like some college kids might gravitate to, where anarchism is just, oh, I don't want to like, yeah, I hate order. I hate obeying people. And it's this sort of like, I don't know, fatherless sort of psychology, I guess. Like the rebel without a cause type stuff. Whereas actual existing anarchism is deeply disciplined, right, to work.
Right. Yeah, it's profoundly concerned with the question of order, right? And as I think you're kind of, I mean, it seeks to order society, without the institution of the state, and actually, if anything, sort of tends to see the state as a source of disorder rather than order. So I agree. Again, I don't think that Michéa is has a lot, places a lot of emphasis on his own anarchism, but there's certainly kind of an element of that there. And I think that is the spirit of that chapter on society's unconscious, as you said. And there's also then sort of the idea that again, the kind of great sort of dissolvent of both sort of, traditional society, traditional community, the values of society, and, as we're now saying, the personality that those types of communities create. The great dissolvent of that, all that for Michéa is liberalism, right? And I actually think that, in his work, he's come to a place where everything that is a problem with capitalism is fundamentally sort of, a problem of liberalism. And this is, we haven't said that much about it, but this is, I think, is the heart of his, argument about the unity of liberalism, namely that cultural liberalism and economic liberalism go hand in hand. And this is where I have to say this point that I just kind of wanted to squeeze in there from the beginning, because I think this is quite confusing, especially for people in the United States. I don't know. I think that there's a similar vocabulary in Canada, but I'm not positive. I mean, I know you've got sort of the Liberal Party, but when Michéa, and it's just clearer when you say it in French. When you say the term liberalism in French, when you say libéralisme, it almost always connotes the sort of tradition that goes back to the 19th century that Americans call classic liberalism, to distinguish it from the fact that in the early 20th century, the term liberalism essentially was sort of adopted to refer to what we now call progressivism, which is kind of a sort of blend, I guess you could say, of just a little bit of socialism, or at least concerns with redistribution and the use of the state for various social goals, with classical liberalism. So in any case, when Michéa is talking about economic liberalism, he means something like, free market the free market idea. And his the core of his argument is that cultural liberalism, by which he specifically means things like the emphasis on sort of reining back oppressive norms, sexual liberation, emphasis on things like multiculturalism, fighting various forms of social injustice, that in his view, those things are kind of deeply, deeply sort of interwoven with the capitalist idea of the free market. And, you kind of already alluded to the way the argument works, and you definitely find this in Lasch, namely that they are both about maximizing individual freedom from any constraint and any, in a sense, kind of almost any form of sociality, any form of sort of social value or social norm is presented as being oppressive, either because it reins in, the creative forces of the market, or because it places limits on,
individual freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Which is very convenient for a consumer economy. Part of his whole point.
That's exactly right.
The new superego is one not of Weber's Protestant work ethic of, you need to be austere and not consume. You need to save money. You need to work harder. It's now you need to work harder so you can consume more, so you can live your best life. Right. You should feel guilty for not, having enough fun, right?
Yeah.
And it's very like a Žižekian point.
Yeah,
it's part of this new wave.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's part of this new wave of thinkers that I gravitate to, like Young Chul.
I completely agree. And I agree. And I think, Zizek, I think, has a much more sort of developed theory. I mean, I find you have to sort of piece it together with Zizek because it's in all these different places. But there is a kind of, I think, a real sort of almost kind of system, in Zizek, whereas, I think Michéa is much more of a sort of intuitive thinker and polemicist and things like that. But I think they're very much on the same page. And I don't know how deeply he's read Zizek, but he's certainly read him some and is very much on board with it. Yeah. So, but
Lasch, because Lasch made
maybe,
similar point, just with the different readings of Freud. Like they have they have different ways in which they read Freud, but they come to similar conclusions. Like the culture of narcissism and minimal self is more or less making that sort of argument about like
yeah,
how there's when minimal self
that's right.
especially I think is really good because he talks about Lasch talks about the liberal and conservative and leftist, like the conservative being sort of like the id, the liberals being the super ego, which is trying to this technocratic, I want to control, like be careful, be politically correct. Meanwhile, leftism actually paradoxically plays a role too in the capitalist superstructure as this sort of like liberatory, I want to enjoy
That's right.
freedom, me, which is
Yeah.
interesting, right? We're not used to thinking about it. We're used to thinking of like the left is like opposed to the status quo rather than being part of it.
Yeah. No, I think that is absolutely right. And I think that is the essence of Michéa's argument. And, and a lot of his energy goes into, just kind of eviscerating the contemporary left, especially in France, because he thinks that, that being on the left is almost sort of has become sort of completely defined by those issues, cultural liberation, cultural freedom, and has just kind of, again, it's the issue is not that it's sort of just kind of, you know, separated itself from working class culture, but it now regards, it regards sort of whatever working class culture is now as a form of barbarism, So, and that's, I think, kind of what alarms him.
I think it's a good moment to go into the back room to
Okay.
finish the remaining part, where we can talk
Okay.
more about this concept of like leftism and liberalism and Michéa's critique of leftism's complicity in liberalism and what exactly he has beef with. Because one thing that would be worth elaborating on is maybe his critique of immigration. I
Yeah.
think Michéa provides tools to talk about these problems that the really so far the right has monopolized discourse on, while the left's kind of buried their head in the sand, but able to do it from a non, like fascistic reactionary
Right.
point of view. Or, I mean, well, to the some parts of the left, this is going to seem reactionary anyway. But I think
Right.
it's obvious to anyone with any nuance that Michéa's perspective is anything but fascist. Yeah.
Sure.
So see you in the back room. You get access to over 80 exclusive episodes, and you get access to the Discord server as well. And we'll see you there.
Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
I am sick and tired of revolutionaries or protest movements which focus on those ecstatic moments. Oh my God, 1 million people on Syntagma Square, on Tahrir in Istanbul, and so on. We were all so enthusiastic there, and so on and so on. I'm not impressed by that at all. I think this is even relatively easy to do. The true test of a revolution or radical social change is how do ordinary people experience the change when the ecstatic moment is over, when things return to normal. That's the most difficult task. When nothing happens, when just everyday life is here, how is this everyday life different from the previous everyday life?